Part 1. Exposition Eggs, Red Dust, and Judgment. The sun was not yet a tyrant. It was a promise, a faint line of liquid gold bleeding into the bruised purple of the pre-dawn horizon. But in Dry Creek, Arizona territory, promises were as fickle as the water in Juniper Spring. Eliza Mayfield felt the coming heat in the grit of the air, a fine red dust that settled on everything, coating the tongue and clinging to the damp skin at her temples. It was the dust of 1878, a year that was already shaping up to be drier than the last. Her basket, cradled in the crook of her arm, was heavy with the morning's collection. 27 eggs, each one a small, perfect miracle of brown and pale blue, nestled in straw. They were her currency, her shield, her reason for walking with her back straight even when her spirit wanted to slump. At 19, Eliza knew the weight of things. She knew the weight of this basket, the weight of the 2 graves on the hill behind her small cabin, and, most of all, the weight of being the Mayfield girl, the orphan, the one who lived alone, the subject of whispers that coiled and struck like rattlesnakes in the long shadows of the afternoon. The walk to the Saturday market was a ritual of quiet defiance. She kept her eyes on the path, a ribbon of trampled earth winding between skeletal ocotillo and the patient, looming saguaros that stood like sentinels of this harsh land. Crows circled high overhead, their calls like scraps of black silk tearing in the wind. They were waiting, always waiting, for something to falter. Eliza tightened her grip on the basket. She would not falter. As she entered the single dusty street that constituted Dry Creek, the town was stirring to life. The smell of wood smoke and brewing coffee mingled with the ever-present scent of horses and sun-baked earth. From the swinging doors of Vane's saloon, even at this early hour, came the low murmur of men's voices and the stale odor of last night's whiskey. Eliza averted her gaze, her chin tucking just an inch. The whispers always started there, nurtured in the saloon's gloom by its owner, Luther Vane, a man who collected rumors as diligently as he collected debts. "There she is," a voice drifted. "Low and rough, fresh eggs for sale." The emphasis on fresh was a barb, a crude insinuation she had learned to ignore, though it still stung like a splash of a lie. She felt the eyes on her, stripping away her dignity layer by layer, leaving her feeling exposed under the vast, indifferent sky. They saw a girl without a father, without a brother, without a husband. They saw an opportunity. Eliza saw only the small patch of ground where she would lay her checkered cloth and arrange her eggs, her small claim on the world. She had just found her spot near the blacksmith's forge when the commotion started. It began with a shout, sharp with panic, followed by the splintering crack of wood and the terrified whinny of a horse. A supply wagon, left untethered by a careless driver, had begun to roll backward down the slight incline of the street, gathering speed, directly in its path. A small boy with a shock of black hair stood frozen, his eyes wide with terror as he clutched a stray dog. People scattered, women screamed, men shouted useless instructions, but before the inevitable could happen, a rider moved with a fluid violence that was almost beautiful. He came from nowhere, a silhouette of man and horse against the rising sun. His buckskin gelding responded to an unspoken command, surging forward not away from the danger, but toward it, in one seamless motion. The rider leaned low from the saddle, his arm scooping the boy, little Tom Ortega, the new stable hand from up at the mesa, and the dog into his lap. He spurred his horse clear just as the wagon smashed into a watering trough, sending a cascade of precious water and shattered timber across the road. The rider brought his horse to a gentle stop, his hand resting reassuringly on little Tom's shaking shoulders. He was a tall man, broad in the shoulders but lean, weathered by the sun and wind into something as hard and enduring as the land itself. His hat was pulled low, but as he looked down at the boy, Eliza saw the firm line of his jaw and a face that was all angles and shadows. This was Cole Hart, owner of the Hart Mesa Ranch, A man spoken of in tones of respect and sometimes fear, a widower, a man who kept to himself. He dismounted, setting the boy and his dog safely on the ground. "You watch your step, son," he said, his voice a low rumble. Not unkind. Little Tom could only nod, his face pale. As Cole Hart turned to lead his horse away from the wreckage, his eyes met Eliza's. It was only for a moment, a fleeting connection across the dusty street. His gaze was direct, a cool gray like river stones. It held no judgment, no pity, none of the leering curiosity she was used to. It simply saw her, and in the depths of that cool gray, she thought she saw a flicker of something else, a warmth buried so deep it was almost imperceptible, like the last embers of a fire banked for the night. The look unsettled her more than any insult. It was a look that acknowledged her as a person, not a piece of town gossip. Then it was gone. He tipped his hat a fraction of an inch and moved on, leading his horse toward the livery. The town buzzed with the near tragedy, the excitement breaking the morning's torpor. But for Eliza, the moment stretched, leaving an echo in the quiet spaces of her mind. She shook her head, forcing herself back to the present, to the reality of the eggs that needed selling. Business was slow. The drought was pinching everyone's pockets. Women would stop, admire the eggs, ask the price, and then sigh, shaking their heads as they moved on to buy cheaper staples like flour and beans. Eliza remained patient. She would not lower her price. Her hens were well fed, their eggs rich and fine. They were worth what she asked. It was a matter of honor. Just as the sun began to assert its full authority, a man detached himself from the shadows of the saloon's porch and ambled toward her. It was Jed, one of Luther Vane's men, a creature with shifty eyes and a perpetually greasy sheen to his skin. "Mornin', Miss Mayfield," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes. He gestured at her basket. "Mister, Vane's in need of a dozen, for the kitchen." Eliza nodded, her movements precise as she selected 12 of the finest eggs and placed them carefully in a smaller basket. "That'll be 12 cents. Jed chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "Mister, Vane said to put it on his account." Eliza's hand stilled. Her heart gave a hard, slow thump against her ribs. An account, a debt. It was how Vane worked. He'd extend a small kindness, a line of credit, and then the rope would tighten. She had seen it happen to a dozen families. Good people who ended up losing a horse, a plow, sometimes even their land, over a few dollars of credit at the saloon or the general store Vane also owned. "I don't keep accounts," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Cash only." Jed's smile vanished. "Now, listen here, mister. Vane is trying to be neighborly. A girl like you, all alone. It's good to have friends in this town. Friends who can help out." He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "Heard him saying just the other day how a woman without a man to guide her can be persuaded to see sense. He's just offering a hand." The threat was veiled, but it was there, as clear as the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. Persuaded. The word was slick with implications she refused to consider. She thought of Juniper Spring, how its flow had lessened to a trickle over the past weeks. Old Man Hemlock, whose farm was downstream, swore someone was damming it upriver, but he was too scared of Vane, whose property bordered the upper spring, to make a formal complaint. Vane was collecting more than debts. He was collecting power, drop by precious drop. Eliza lifted her chin, her eyes meeting Jed's without flinching. "My hens don't eat credit, sir, and neither do I." She began to pack the dozen eggs back into her main basket. Jed's face darkened, a flush creeping up his neck. He wasn't used to being refused, especially not by her. He looked around, ensuring he had an audience. He saw a few townsfolk watching, their faces carefully blank. He saw Cole Hart emerging from the livery, his expression unreadable from this distance. Jed straightened up, his voice loud enough to carry, Suit yourself, he sneered, turning his back on her. But as he walked away, he tossed a final comment over his shoulder, a piece of poison for the whole market to hear. Have it your way, girl. But remember this. In Dry Creek, you either drink someone's water or you go thirsty. The words hung in the hot, still air long after he was gone. It was no longer about eggs. It had never been about eggs. It was about control, about who owned the water, who owned the debt, and who owned the future. Eliza looked down at her basket of perfect, fragile eggs, and for the first time that morning, she felt the true, crushing weight of them. Each one was a choice, and she had just made hers. Now, she would have to live with the thirst. Part 2. Inciting Incident. The Crack in Juniper Spring. The hot wind that swept down from the mesas was a physical blow, a thief that stole the moisture from the air and the hope from a man's heart. It rattled the dry husks of last year's corn in the fields and whipped the red dust into stinging clouds. Cole Hart felt it on his ranch, Hart Mesa, where the land stretched out in vast, thirsty plains. His horses, usually sleek and full of fire, stood with their heads low, conserving energy. Their water troughs, fed by a diversion from Juniper Spring, were lower than he'd ever seen them for this time of year. He'd spent the morning riding the perimeter of his property, his gray eyes scanning the horizon, reading the story the land was telling him. It was a tale of distress. The cottonwoods along the creek bed were wilting, their leaves turning a brittle yellow weeks before their time. This wasn't just a dry spell. Something was actively choking the lifeblood of the valley. Mounting his buckskin, he turned upstream, his jaws set in a hard line. He didn't need a map to know the spring's path, nor did he need a prophet to guess where the trouble lay. He found it less than a mile up, where the creek narrowed between two rocky bluffs on land Luther Vane had acquired in a poker game last winter. A crude dam of felled logs, river stones, and packed mud blocked the main channel. It wasn't built to last, but it was built to work. A significant portion of the spring's flow was being siphoned off into a ditch that led directly toward Vane's holdings. It was a quiet, insidious act of theft, stealing water not just from Cole, but from every family downstream. It was Vane's signature, a power play disguised as circumstance, a stranglehold applied so slowly that the victim barely felt it until it was too late to breathe. Cole stared at the sluggish, diverted water, the handiwork of a man who understood that in a desert. He who controls the water controls everything. He turned his horse around, a cold, calculated anger settling deep in his gut. Back in Dry Creek, Eliza had finally sold her last half-dozen eggs to the blacksmith's wife. She folded her checkered cloth, the few coins she'd earned feeling small and insignificant in her pocket. The heat was oppressive now, the sun a white-hot coin in a bleached sky. She felt a weary sense of relief, the small victory of having survived another market day, another gauntlet of stares and whispers. She was just about to lift her empty basket when a shadow fell over her. Miss Mayfield. The voice was flat, carrying an authority that was both official and hollow. Sheriff Asa Pike stood before her, his badge catching a blinding glint of sun. He was a man in his 30s, with a soft middle that belied the hardness in his eyes. He was Vane's brother-in-law, a connection that explained his position far better than any skill or virtue he possessed. Sheriff, Eliza acknowledged, her voice carefully neutral. Been some talk, Pike began, hooking his thumbs in his belt. Complaints about weights and measures at the market. Just doing my due diligence. Need to inspect your goods. Eliza gestured to her empty basket. As you can see, Sheriff, I'm sold out for the day. Pike's eyes narrowed. Them eggs you just sold. The basket you sold 'em from. Town ordinance requires me to check your equipment to ensure fair trade. It was nonsense. A rule invented on the spot. And they both knew it. This was a performance. And she was the unwilling star. With a sigh of resignation, she handed him the basket. He took it, turning it over in his hands with an exaggerated show of scrutiny. He ran a thumb over the woven reeds, peered inside, and then, with a sudden, clumsy lurch, as if he'd tripped on a loose stone, he lost his grip. The basket flew from his hands, landing with a dull thud on the hard-packed earth. It was empty, but the message was clear. It was a demonstration of how easily things could be broken. "Now look what you made me do," Pike said, a smirk playing on his lips. Creating a disturbance, that's another ordinance violation. He was enjoying this, the slow, methodical humiliation. "You're responsible for this disruption. There's a fine, 2 bits. 25 cents. It was more than half of what she had earned all morning. Her face paled. "A fine for what? For you dropping my basket?" "For disorderly conduct," he snapped, his voice turning sharp. "Pay the fine, or I'll have to take you in." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Or you could talk to Mr. Vane. He's always willing to help a citizen in need. A small loan, perhaps to be paid back in services." The threat hung in the air, vile and suffocating. This was the trap. This was how they ensnared people. They broke your eggs, then fined you for the shells. Eliza's throat felt tight with a mixture of rage and despair. She was reaching into her pocket, her fingers trembling, when a quiet voice cut through the tension. "I'll take care of it, Sheriff." Cole Hart stood a few feet away, his horse's reins in his hand. He had come upon the scene in its final, ugly moments. He didn't look at Eliza. His cool gray eyes were fixed on Pike, and they held a look of such profound contempt that the sheriff took an involuntary step back. Cole's hand went to his pocket, but before he could produce any money, Eliza found her voice. "No," she said, the word coming out stronger than she expected. "I will pay it myself." Her pride was all she had left. She would not let them take that. 2. She pulled out her coins and counted 25 cents into Pike's waiting palm. Pike, flustered by Hart's unexpected presence, snatched the money and tipped his hat with mock courtesy. "Pleasure doing business with you, ma'am." He swaggered off toward the saloon, the victor of a battle no one else had known was being fought. Eliza was left standing in the dust, her empty basket at her feet, her body shaking with reaction. She bent to retrieve the basket, her vision blurring with unshed tears of frustration. As she straightened up, she saw something on the ground where she had stood. It was a silver dollar, old and worn smooth, shining in the dirt. She looked up. Cole Hart was already halfway down the street, leading his horse, his back to her. He hadn't paid her fine, but he had left the means to erase its sting. And then some. He had done it silently, without drawing attention, without demanding thanks. Clutching the coin, she fled. She didn't go home. She went to the one place in Dry Creek where she felt safe, the small tailor shop run by her friend, Ruthie Salgado. Ruthie was a widow of 28, with sharp, intelligent eyes and hands that were never still. She took one look at Eliza's pale face and set aside the shirt she was mending. "Spit it out," she said, her tone gentle but firm. Between shaky breaths, Eliza told her everything, Jed, the refusal of credit, Sheriff Pike, the dropped basket, the invented fine. Finally, she opened her palm and showed Ruthie the silver dollar. "He just left it." Cole Hart. Ruthie whistled softly. "That's Vane's work, through and through. He's trying to put a rope on you. Eliza, he sees a woman alone and thinks easy prey." She looked at the coin. "And Hart, he's a different kind of complicated. Be careful. A man like that doesn't do things for no reason. A gift from a man like Vane is a chain. A gift from a man like Hart might be a different kind of debt." She picked up her needle again. "If you need honest work, you know my door is always open, but don't let yourself be bought, not by anyone." Ruthie's words sank deep. A debt. That's what the coin felt like. It felt like charity. It felt like he was pitying her, seeing her as the helpless orphan girl the rest of the town saw. Her spine stiffened. She had paid her own fine. She had stood up to Jed, She would not be a charity case. Her honor was not for sale, and it could not be rescued with a silver dollar. "I'm taking it back," she said, her voice filled with a sudden, fierce resolve. Ruthie raised an eyebrow, all the way up to Heart Mesa Eliza. "That's a long ride for a short speech." "It's not the distance that matters," Eliza replied, her hand closing tightly around the coin. "It's the principle." The ride to Heart Mesa was daunting. Her small mare was sturdy but slow, and the sun beat down relentlessly. The higher she climbed into the foothills, the more the world opened up, vast and intimidating. This was Coldheart's domain, a kingdom of rock and dust and sky. When she finally saw the ranch, it took her breath away. It wasn't a simple homestead. It was a compound with a strong main house, long stables, and a series of interconnected corrals, all built with a permanence that defied the harsh landscape. She found him in the largest corral, working with a young horse. She dismounted and watched from a distance, her heart pounding. Cole wasn't using force. He was using a language of subtle shifts in weight, of quiet murmurs and patient hands. He moved with the horse, anticipating its fear, rewarding its trust. It was a partnership, a dance of discipline and respect. In that moment, she saw the man behind the silent, formidable reputation. She saw strength, yes, but it was a quiet, controlled strength, rooted in understanding, not dominance. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out from behind the stable wall. He saw her immediately, his work with the horse pausing. He showed no surprise, just a quiet watchfulness. She walked to the fence, her boots sinking into the soft dust. She held out the silver dollar. "I believe this is yours," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I appreciate the thought, mister. Heart, but I pay my own way." He walked toward her, wiping his hands on his trousers. He didn't look at the coin she offered. He looked at her face, at the stubborn pride in her eyes. A long moment passed. The only sounds were the wind and the soft stamp of a horse's hoof. "I know you do," he said, his voice a low rumble. He still didn't take the coin. Instead, his gaze became thoughtful. "It's hard to find people who do, people you can trust." He paused, and she saw him make a decision. "I need someone to manage my kitchen and keep the supply ledgers. The work is piling up. Little Tom tells me you can read and write." Eliza was stunned into silence. A job, real, paid work. It was a lifeline thrown from the most unexpected quarter imaginable. It was a chance at independence, a shield against Vane and his schemes. It would be a position of trust, he continued, his eyes holding hers. "You would have a room in the main house. The pay is fair. It is not charity, Miss Mayfield. It is a business proposition." She looked down at the silver dollar still resting on her open palm. It was no longer a symbol of charity, but a catalyst. It had brought her here, forced a confrontation that had led to this opportunity. Her fear of being indebted to him warred with her desperate need for a foothold in a world determined to see her fall. She saw the integrity she had witnessed in the corral reflected in his straightforward offer. She closed her fingers around the coin, a silent acceptance of the past, and looked up to meet his gaze, ready to claim her future. "Yes," she said, "I accept." Part 3. The Virgin Who Brought Eggs to Market, Until His Kiss. A week of breathing the clean, high Mesa air had put a new straightness in Eliza's spine. The work at Heart Mesa was demanding but honest. She managed the storerooms, kept meticulous ledgers of supplies, and brought an order to the ranch's chaotic kitchen that the ranch hands, including a grateful little Tom, openly appreciated. For the first time since her parents' passing, she felt the solid ground of purpose beneath her feet. She was no longer just the orphan girl. She was Miss Mayfield, the housekeeper at Heart Mesa, a position of responsibility. Yet, when Saturday came, she filled her basket with eggs. It was a conscious decision, a refusal to be chased out of her own life, To stop coming to the market would be an admission of defeat, a concession that Vane and his whispers had won. So she walked the familiar path into Dry Creek. Her chin held a fraction higher than before. The atmosphere was different. The whispers that had once been tinged with a cruel pity were now sharp with speculation. Her association with Cole Hart had made her more visible, a more interesting target. She laid her checkered cloth in its usual spot, the murmurs from the porch of Vane's saloon a low, buzzing irritant, like flies on a hot day. Jed was there, along with a handful of other men who seemed to orbit Vane's establishment. They had clearly been drinking since sunrise. "Looky here," one of them called out, his voice slurring. "It's the Mesa Queen herself. Come down to visit us common folk." Eliza focused on arranging her eggs into neat pyramids, her face a mask of calm she did not feel. "Wonder what kind of housekeeping she does for a lonely man like Hart," another one sneered, followed by a round of greasy laughter. "Bet his accounts ain't the only thing she's keeping in order." The comments grew bolder, each one a small, dirty fingerprint on her reputation. They spoke of her as if she were a piece of property, a creature without hearing or feeling. She felt her cheeks burn with a hot, helpless shame, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the edge of her basket. She would endure. It was then that Cole Hart rode into town. He moved with the quiet efficiency that defined him, dismounting in front of the blacksmith's shop. He was there to see about a new set of shoes for his gelding, but his first stop was to have a quiet word with the blacksmith, handing over a small, discreet pouch of coins. Eliza knew from the kitchen ledgers that the Miller family owed the blacksmith for a plow repair they couldn't afford. It was a debt Cole was erasing without fanfare, another of his silent interventions. As he finished his business, he turned, his path taking him directly past Eliza's stall. He saw the cluster of men by the saloon, saw the direction of their leering gazes, and understood the situation in an instant. Without breaking stride, he stopped beside her, ostensibly to inspect a horseshoe from the blacksmith, but his tall, solid frame created an unspoken shield. He stood between her and her tormentors. "Morning, Miss Mayfield," he said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the men's chatter. "Eggs look fine today." His simple, respectful greeting was like a splash of cool water on her burning face, but his presence only seemed to embolden the drunks, who now saw a chance to provoke the formidable rancher. Jed stepped forward, emboldened by liquor. "No need to be so formal." "Hart, we all know a girl living under a man's roof ain't concerned with formalities. A woman alone is easy pickings for a man with a big ranch." The insult was direct and ugly. It wasn't just aimed at Eliza anymore. It was a public challenge, an accusation that Cole was using his position to take advantage of her. The market seemed to hold its breath. A fistfight seemed inevitable, a raw, violent confrontation that would only drag her name further into the mud. Eliza felt a wave of nausea. This was it. The moment her honor was torn to shreds in the town square for everyone to see. But Cole did not raise his fists. He did something far more devastating. He turned slowly, his cool gray eyes ignoring the drunken fools. He looked at Eliza. In his gaze, she saw a storm of emotions, anger, regret for putting her in this position, and a silent request for her trust. He reached out, his calloused hand surprisingly gentle as it cupped her chin, tilting her face upward. The world narrowed to the space between them. She saw the fine lines etched by the sun around his eyes. She smelled the scent of leather, dust, and something else, something clean and uniquely him. He leaned down, and in the sudden, profound silence that fell over the entire street, he pressed his lips to her forehead. It was not a kiss of passion, nor of ownership. It was firm, warm, and lasted only a second. It was a gesture of profound respect, a seal of protection placed upon her in front of the entire town. It was a statement clearer than any punch he could have thrown. This woman is worthy of honor, and I am the one who will guarantee it. The silence was absolute. A vacuum where the jeers and whispers had been. People stared, their mouths agape. In that moment, he had single-handedly rewritten the narrative. Then, the silence was broken by a single, mocking sound, the slow, deliberate clap of hands. Luther Vane stood on the porch of his saloon, a cigarillo clamped between his teeth and a look of amused contempt on his face. He had watched the entire exchange, waiting for his moment. "Well, well," Vane drawled, his voice carrying across the square. A touching little scene. He took a drag from his cigarillo, letting the smoke curl from his lips. "Looks like the mighty Cole Hart is done with the chase." He paused for effect, his eyes glittering with malice as he looked from Cole to Eliza and back again. "No need for the rest of us to go hunting the nest for him now. Is there—" "Boys." The phrase was a vile piece of frontier slang, a crude metaphor for taking a woman's virtue. It was designed to twist Cole's act of respect into a public claim of possession and to brand Eliza as a conquest. It stripped away all dignity from the moment, leaving only a slimy, public humiliation. Vane's men roared with laughter. A few townsfolk chuckled nervously, while others looked away in shame. Eliza felt as if she had been physically struck. The warmth of Cole's kiss on her forehead turned to ice. Vane had taken a gesture of protection and forged it into a weapon against her. Her worst fears had come true, magnified 100-fold. Her name, her honor, was now the punchline to a dirty joke in Vane's saloon. Cole's body went rigid, a muscle clenched in his jaw. Eliza saw the fury in his eyes, a cold, dangerous fire. He had tried to douse a flame and had instead given his enemy oil to throw on it. He faced a stark choice: walk away, leave her to the mercy of the gossip he had just inflamed, and preserve his own peace, or stand his ground and declare war. He made his choice. He did not look at Vane. To acknowledge him would be to play his game. Instead, Cole Hart turned his gaze to the silent, watching faces of the community. The blacksmith, the store owner, Pastor Crow, who was trying to look intently at a loose wagon wheel. His voice was not a shout, but it had the sharp, clear ring of forged steel. "Eliza Mayfield is a woman of honor." He stated, his words precise and deliberate. "She is under my roof, and she is under my protection." He let that sink in, his eyes moving from face to face, demanding their attention, their complicity. Then he delivered the final, irrevocable blow. Anyone who speaks another foul word against her will answer for it, directly to me." It was not a threat. It was a vow. A line had been drawn in the red dust of Dry Creek. The whispers died in the throats of those who heard him. Vane's smile tightened at the edges, the humor gone, replaced by a cold assessment. Without another word, Cole turned to Eliza. Her legs felt weak, her mind a whirlwind of shock and shame. He gently took her arm. "Come," he said softly. "Let's go home." He led her away from her stall, away from the shattered remnants of her mourning, leaving the stunned market and the smoldering gaze of Luther Vane behind them. Part 4. Rising Action Water, Fire, and Rumors. The ride back to Hart Mesa was a silent one, thick with unspoken things. The shame of the market still clung to Eliza like the red dust. But beneath it, a strange and novel feeling was taking root, the feeling of not being entirely alone. Cole's public vow had been a shield, but it was also a cage, defining her by his protection. The quiet sanctuary of the ranch house became her world. By day, she brought a quiet order to the chaos of his bachelor existence, her pen scratching in the ledgers, tracing the flow of flour and feed, a stark contrast to the lawless flow of power in the town below. But it was in the evenings that a new kind of hope began to flicker. The lamps would be lit in the main room, and Eliza would sit at the large oak table with little Tom and two of the younger ranch hands, both barely men, who had never had the chance to learn their letters. She taught them how to shape an A, how to sound out a word, in the quiet focus of their faces, in little Tom's triumphant shout when he first read the word horse from a feed sack. She found a purpose that was wholly her own. She was not just a housekeeper or a subject of gossip. She was a teacher. She was building something that Vane's whispers could not touch. Cole would often stand in the shadows of the doorway, watching for a few moments, his expression unreadable, before retreating into the cool of the night. Down in Dry Creek, the drought's invisible fist continued to tighten, and Luther Vane was the one directing its fingers. He preyed on the desperation, offering loans for seed and supplies at ruinous rates. Ruthie Salgado, on a visit to the mesa to deliver a mended saddle blanket, told Eliza of the town's growing fear. "He's collecting promissory notes like a preacher collects sins," she said, her needle flying. "The Miller family, the Hankses, he'll own half the valley by winter if we don't get rain." Vane's attack soon became more direct. One afternoon, Sheriff Pike rode up to the ranch, 2 deputies flanking him. He didn't dismount, but unrolled a scroll with a flourish, declaring that a formal complaint had been filed against Cole Hart for the illegal and malicious diversion of community water resources. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. "There's a fine of $20, Pike announced, a smug look on his face. Cole stood on the porch, his face carved from stone. He knew protesting was futile. It was Vane's law, Pike's enforcement. He went inside, returned with the money, and handed it to the sheriff without a word. The legal maneuver was a public branding, an official declaration that Hart, not Vane, was the thief. The lie was now on the record. As the weeks wore on, the land grew brittle, the grass crackled underfoot, and the sun beat down with a malevolent, personal fury. The air was thick with the threat of fire, and one blistering afternoon, that threat became real. A spark from a cast horseshoe in the stony yard was all it took. A gust of hot wind caught it, and a patch of sun-scorched brush exploded into a wall of roaring flame, racing with terrifying speed directly toward the main stable. Panic erupted. Men shouted. Horses screamed in their stalls. For a moment, chaos reigned. Then, through the smoke and confusion, Eliza's voice cut through, clear and calm, a line from the well now. While the men had been grabbing rifles and looking for the source, she had been thinking about the solution. Her command, born of pure survival instinct, galvanized them. Cole, emerging from the stables after trying to calm the horses, saw in amazement as she organized a bucket brigade. Little Tom, the older hands, even the grizzled cook, she had them all moving as one, their panic replaced by focused action. Eliza stood at the head of the line, her dress soaked, her face smudged with soot, taking the heavy buckets and throwing the water with a desperate, rhythmic efficiency onto the devouring flames. She worked until her arms felt like lead, until her lungs burned with smoke. Her mind narrowed to a single point: save this place. They fought the fire for an hour that felt like a lifetime. When the last of the flames were beaten into a smoldering, blackened scar on the earth just yards from the stable wall, they collapsed, gasping, exhausted, and victorious. That night, a silence settled over the ranch, deeper than mere quiet. It was a silence of shared ordeal and bone-deep weariness. Eliza was sitting on the porch steps, trying to clean her soot-stained hands, when Cole came and sat near her, not beside her, but a respectful distance away. "The stable would be gone if it weren't for you," he said, his voice rough with smoke and something else. "You saved it." She shook her head. "We all did." He was quiet for a long time, staring out at the scorched earth shimmering under the moonlight. "Eliza," he began, the name sounding unfamiliar in the darkness. "I'm sorry for what I did in town. The kiss." He finally looked at her, his face grim. "I thought I was shielding you. Instead, I put a bigger target on your back. I made Vane's game worse for you. It was a fool's move, and you've paid the price for it." His apology was so direct, so stripped of pride, that it disarmed her. "You were trying to help," she whispered. "It doesn't matter what my intention was. He insisted. It hurt you, and for that, I am truly sorry." He looked away again, This arrangement, you working here, it needs to be clear. I will protect this ranch and everyone on it. But I won't make that kind of claim on you again. What we have is a roof and a wage. Respect, that's all." She understood. He was building a wall between them for her protection. He was giving her space, giving her back a piece of the autonomy his actions had cost her. "Respect first," she agreed, her voice soft but firm. "The rest can sort itself out later." They sat in the charged silence, a new boundary drawn between them, a line of respect that felt more intimate than any kiss. In town, others were wrestling with their own boundaries. Ruthie Salgado found Pastor Crow sweeping the steps of his small, sun-bleached church. "Pastor," she said, her tone leaving no room for pleasantries, "you saw what Sheriff Pike did to Eliza. You see these families' vein is squeezing dry. You hear the lies he tells, and you say nothing. Does your God approve of silence in the face of theft and cruelty?" The pastor flinched, his face etched with a weary fear. "Luther Vane is a powerful man. Ruthie, he contributes to the church." "He buys your silence," she corrected him sharply. "And one day, you'll have to account for what you did with it." She left him there, his broom still, his soul as troubled as the dusty ground at his feet. The following Saturday, Eliza packed her egg basket. Cole tried to talk her out of it. "There's no need. You don't have to face them." "That's why I have to," she replied, her eyes clear and determined. "If I hide, I'm telling them they've won." When she arrived at the market, a hush fell. Luther Vane was on his porch, a smug grin spreading across his face. He saw her as a wounded animal he could toy with. "Well, if it isn't Hart's little pet," he called out, his voice dripping with condescension. "Did he let you off your leash for the day?" This time, Eliza did not ignore him. She did not lower her eyes. She set her basket down carefully and walked directly toward the saloon, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. She looked up at him, her expression not angry, but filled with a calm, unshakable dignity. The whole market was watching. "Mr. Vane," she said, her voice quiet but carrying in the stillness. "You made a comment last week, a vulgar comment about hunting a—" Vane's grin widened. "I might have. You seem to believe a woman's honor is something for men like you to chase and trap," she continued, her gaze unwavering. She let the silence stretch for a beat. "I'm here to tell you that you are wrong." She took a step closer, and her voice rose just enough for everyone to hear. "My nest is my honor, Mr. Vane, and it is one you will never be able to hunt." It was as if she had thrown a lightning bolt. She had taken his filthiest weapon, his power to shame, and rendered it useless. She had redefined his terms and declared her own invulnerability. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd, not of mockery, but of stunned admiration. She had faced the bully and had not flinched. Vane's face went rigid, the smug amusement replaced by a flash of cold fury. She had wounded his pride, and had done so publicly. Without another glance, Eliza turned, walked back to her spot, and began to sell her eggs. Her courage lit a fire in Cole. That afternoon, he rode back up to the illegal dam, no longer just to observe, but to find proof. He searched the area, his eyes missing nothing. Tucked under a rock, half buried in the mud, he found it a small leather pouch for whetstones, identical to the one he'd seen Jed, Vane's man, carry 100 times, and stamped faintly on the leather was Vane's own brand, a lazial from a failed cattle venture years ago. He rode back to the mesa, the pouch a hard knot in his pocket. He had the proof. That evening, he told Eliza his plan. "I'm not paying another fine. I'm not waiting for Pike to act. On Sunday, after the sermon, I'm going to stand up in front of the whole town. I'm going to show them this. And I'm going to tell them the truth about the water. We'll see who they believe." But news traveled fast in Dry Creek. A boy fishing for crawdads had seen Cole near the upper spring. The boy mentioned it to his father. who mentioned it while buying a drink at Vane's saloon. That night, as Vane cleaned glasses behind the bar, Jed leaned in. That rancher, Hart, he was snooping around the dam again today. Looked like he found something. Luther Vane stopped polishing. He placed the glass down with a soft click. His eyes were cold and flat. The game of whispers and fines was over. Eliza Mayfield had defied him, and now Cole Hart was coming for his water. It was time for a different kind of lesson. "Jed," he said, his voice dangerously soft, "get a few of the boys. Hart needs to be taught a lesson about respecting another man's property, a lesson he won't forget." Part V. Climax, hailstones. Ambush, and the choice to stand together. Cole's decision was not born of patience. The knowledge of Vane's men preparing for a lesson was a coiled snake in his gut. To wait until Sunday was to invite an attack on his own land. On his own terms, he would not wait. He would act. Before dawn the next morning, under a sky the color of a fresh bruise, he gathered his most trusted hands in the barn. "We're not waiting," he told them, his voice low and hard. "We're taking that dam down today. We're giving the water back." Eliza, who had risen with him, stood in the lamplight. She had overheard their hushed conversation. "I'm going with you," she said. It was not a request. Cole turned, his face set. "No, it's too dangerous." "The fire was dangerous," she countered, her gaze steady. "Vane's saloon is dangerous. Hiding is dangerous. I am a part of this ranch now. Mr. Hart, and I will not wait here while others fight for the water I drink." He saw the iron in her spine, the same unbending will that had faced down Vane in the market square. To deny her now would be to deny the very respect he had promised her. He gave a single, sharp nod. Little Tom, standing by the horses, looked from Cole to Eliza, his young face filled with a fierce, unwavering loyalty. He would be going too. They rode out as a small, determined company, not a war party. They carried axes and heavy pry bars, not rifles. This was an act of reclamation, not aggression. As they descended from the mesa, the air grew thick and heavy. The wind, which had been a hot whisper for weeks, was beginning to gather its voice, moaning through the canyons and whipping dust devils across the plains. The sky was a strange, sickly yellow. A storm was coming, but not the gentle, life-giving kind. This felt different. This felt angry. They reached the illegal dam as the first serious gusts of wind began to tear at their clothes. The structure was an ugly scar on the land, the pooled water behind it stagnant and greedy. Without a word, they set to work. The crack of axes against waterlogged wood echoed in the unnatural stillness between wind blasts. It was grueling, back-breaking labor. Cole, working alongside his men, swung his axe with a controlled fury, each blow a strike against Vane's arrogance. Eliza and little Tom worked to pull smaller rocks and debris clear, their hands quickly growing raw. The storm broke upon them not with rain, but with dust. The world vanished in an instant, swallowed by a churning, opaque wall of red. The sun was blotted out. Day became a suffocating twilight. The wind screamed, a physical force that stole their breath and blinded them. They could barely see the men standing next to them. And in that chaos, the first shot rang out. It was a flat, deadly crack, distinct from the howl of the wind. One of the ranch hands cried out, clutching a splintered arm where the bullet had torn through the log beside him. Panic, disoriented and blind, ripped through them. "Get down," Cole bellowed, his voice barely audible over the gale. Behind the rocks. They were caught in the open, horribly exposed, from the bluffs above, hidden by the shroud of dust. Vane's men had opened fire. Jed's ambush. A second shot whined past Eliza's ear, so close she felt its heat. She threw herself to the ground behind a half-dismantled section of the dam, her heart hammering against her ribs. Little Tom was beside her. his face pale with terror but his eyes fixed on Cole. Cole was trying to shove his men toward the meager cover of the opposite bank. "Go move," he roared. As he turned to follow, a length of heavy timber, loosened by their axes and battered by the storm, finally gave way. It crashed down with a sickening thud, pinning Cole's leg to the ground beneath its immense weight. He cried out, a sharp sound of pain that was nearly lost in the wind. He was trapped, an easy target. Through the swirling red haze, Eliza saw shadowy figures beginning to descend from the bluffs, moving in for the kill. Jed was among them. A rifle in his hand, time seemed to slow, each second stretching into an eternity of impossible choices. The ranch hands were pinned down, unable to help. Then, a stray bullet ricocheted off a rock near Little Tom, and a shard of stone flew up, striking the boy's temple. He cried out, more from shock than pain, and stumbled, a thin line of blood trickling down his face. The sight of the boy, so small and vulnerable, broke something in Eliza. The fear that had paralyzed her transformed into a white-hot, protective rage. She wouldn't let them be slaughtered. She wouldn't let Vane win. She had a small, sharp knife at her belt, one she used for cutting twine and opening sacks in the storeroom. It was a tool, not a weapon, but it was all she had. "Stay down, Tom," she commanded, her voice fierce. Ignoring the whine of bullets, she began to crawl. She kept low, using the debris of the dam for cover, her body scraping against the rocks and mud. The wind tore at her, trying to push her back, but she moved forward, her eyes fixed on Cole's trapped form. He saw her coming, his face a mask of agony and disbelief. "Eliza, no, get back!" he yelled, but his voice was a ghost in the storm. She reached him, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and wet earth. A rope, used to lash the main timbers together, was looped over the log, anchored to a stump. If she could cut it, it might release some of the pressure. It was a desperate chance. Her hands, clumsy with adrenaline, worked at the thick, wet hemp. The knife was small, the rope was thick. A bullet kicked up dirt inches from her head. She didn't flinch. She sawed at the rope, strand by strand, her knuckles bleeding, her entire being focused on that single, impossible task. With a final, ragged tear, the rope snapped, the log shifted, not much, but enough. With a monumental effort, Cole dragged his leg free, his face ashen with pain. He was free, but he could barely stand. It was then that a new sound pierced the storm, the clatter of hooves. Sheriff Pike and his 2 deputies rode into the clearing, their guns drawn. But they weren't pointed at the ambushers on the ridge. They were pointed at Cole. "Hold it right there," Hart Pike yelled, his voice triumphant. "You're under arrest for the malicious destruction of private property." Jed and his men, seeing the law had arrived to sanction their violence, grew bolder. Stepping out from the swirling dust, the situation was impossible. It was a perfectly executed trap. But the trap had a flaw. It had not accounted for Eliza Mayfield. She got to her feet, her dress torn, her face smeared with dirt and blood from a scratch on her cheek. She was a fearsome sight. In her hand, she no longer held the small knife. She held a leather-bound ledger. "This isn't private property." "Sheriff," she said, her voice shaking but loud enough to be heard. "It's a crime scene, and this dam is not the only crime Luther Vane has committed." She held up the ledger. It was her own meticulous record, supplemented by names and figures Ruthie had gathered from the terrified townspeople. "This book contains the name of every family mister. Vane is strangling with illegal debt. It details the interest rates, 50, 60%. It lists the fines you've collected for him. Sheriff, it's all here." Pike's smug expression faltered. He stared at the book as if it were a venomous snake. And then another sound began to cut through the howl of the wind. Faint at first, then growing stronger, clearer, more insistent. Clang! 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 It was the church bell. Pastor Crow, His conscience, finally winning its long war with his fear, was ringing it. It was not a call to worship. It was an alarm, a summons, a call for the town to bear witness. Pike's face went pale. He could handle a wounded rancher and a woman in a dust storm. He could not handle the entire town. His authority, which existed only in the shadows of Vane's power, was evaporating. They came on foot and on horseback, drawn by the urgent, unceasing bell. The Millers, the Hankses, the blacksmith, Ruthie Salgado. They emerged from the dust like ghosts, their faces grim, their eyes hard. They saw little Tom's bleeding head, Cole's mangled leg, Eliza standing defiant with her book of truths. They saw Sheriff Pike's gun pointed at the victims. In that moment, with the whole town as his jury, Cole Hart made a choice. He leaned heavily on a pry bar, his face tight with pain, and looked not at Pike, but at the faces of his neighbors. "Pike accuses me of destroying property," he said, his voice raw. "And he's right. I did. But before you judge me, you should know something about me." He took a ragged breath. "Years ago, during the last big drought, I was moving my herd. A small group of prospectors had diverted a trickle of water for their camp. Same as Vane did here, but smaller. My horses were dying of thirst. I was young and proud, and I saw only my own loss." His voice dropped, thick with a shame that was decades old. "I broke their dam and took the water. I told myself it was survival. I never knew what became of them. I rode away and left them to their fate. I've carried that with me every single day." He looked directly at Eliza, his soul bare. "What I did today, it wasn't to save my ranch. It was to stop a man from making the same choice I made. It was to make things right." Eliza's heart ached for him. She saw the wound he had carried for so long, the private debt of honor he had been trying to repay ever since. She moved to his side, her presence a silent testament. "You are here now," she whispered, her words for him alone. "You are making it right. That is the only justice that lives." Suddenly, a figure stumbled out of the dust, his face contorted in a mask of pure fury. It was Luther Vane himself, a pistol in his hand. His plan was in ruins, his power exposed. "You have cost me everything." "Hart!" he screamed, his voice cracking. He raised the pistol, aiming it squarely at Cole's chest. He never fired. Before his finger could tighten on the trigger, the blacksmith was on him, a hammer fist knocking the gun from his hand. Two other ranchers tackled him, driving him to the muddy ground. The community, silent for so long, had finally acted as one. And as Vane lay struggling in the mud, the first drops of rain began to fall, not the stinging pellets of a dust storm, but large, cool, cleansing drops. The wind died down, and the rain came harder, washing the dust from the air, turning the red earth a deep, rich brown. It fell on them all, on the righteous and the fallen, a heavy, steady downpour, a symbol of absolution. The long drought was breaking. The fever was over. Part 6. Falling Action. The Law is Rewritten. The rain fell for 2 days, a steady, soaking baptism that washed the blood from the mud and the fear from the air. It was a time of quiet accounting. Luther Vane was held under guard in the blacksmith's forge, his furious silence more damning than any confession. Sheriff Pike remained in his office, a prisoner of his own tarnished badge, the town's silent contempt a wall he could not breach. At Hart Mesa, the rhythm of life had shifted. Cole's leg was badly broken, and he was confined to a chair on the porch, his restless energy caged and his temper short. But the pain of his injury was secondary to the profound, unsettling peace that had settled in his soul. His confession by the dam, witnessed by his neighbors, had been a lancing of a wound he'd carried for years. It had cost him his pride, but it had given him back his honor. Eliza became the quiet nexus of the ranch. She tended to Cole's injury with a no-nonsense competence, her touch gentle but firm. She managed the ranch hands, directed the much-needed repairs. and kept the ledgers that were now more than a record of supplies. They were a testament to a world where debts were honest and accounts were square. Little Tom, a clean white bandage on his temple, followed her everywhere. A small, devoted shadow. The unspoken dynamic between the rancher and his housekeeper had irrevocably changed. She was no longer under his protection. They were partners in the fragile act of recovery. On the third day, the sun returned, and the town of Dry Creek gathered. They did not meet in the church, with its history of timid silence, but in the open air, on the damp, revitalized banks of Juniper Spring. The water, now running full and clear, provided a constant, gurgling reminder of what they had fought for. Pastor Crow presided, his voice no longer weak, but filled with the humble conviction of a man redeemed. It was not a trial, but a constitutional convention in miniature. One by one, the townspeople stood and spoke. The blacksmith, his hands scrubbed clean of soot, argued for a system based on acreage and need. Mrs. Miller, who had nearly lost everything to Vane, spoke of the necessity of a reserve for the driest months. Ruthie Salgado, sharp and practical, proposed that a portion of the flow be allocated specifically for a town well, so no one would ever be dependent on the whims of an upstream landowner again. Eliza's ledger was passed from hand to hand. The evidence of Vane's economic strangulation laid bare for all to see, based on its damning testimony. They made their first new law: no single man could own both the primary mercantile and hold the town's largest private water rights. They then elected a 3-person water committee to enforce their new, handwritten charter. The blacksmith was the first name chosen. A level-headed rancher named Hank was the second, to the surprise of many. Ruthie Salgado was the third. A new order was taking shape, one built not on fear, but on shared vulnerability and common sense. The meeting was interrupted by the arrival of the county marshal, a tall, grim-faced man whose authority was real and unbought. He had been summoned by a rider sent the day of the showdown. He spent an hour listening, his eyes moving from the faces of the townsfolk to Eliza's ledger, to the sullen, defeated face of Asa Pike, who had been brought before him. The reckoning was quiet and swift. The marshal didn't raise his voice. He simply read from the territorial statutes regarding official corruption and dereliction of duty. Then, he reached out and unpinned the tin star from Pike's chest. The metal, which had once seemed to shine with power, looked cheap and flimsy in the marshal's hand. Pike, stripped of his authority, seemed to shrink, becoming just another man, pale and trembling. Next, Vane was brought from the forge. Even in irons, he radiated a venomous arrogance. He sneered at the assembly, his eyes promising retribution, but his threats were hollow. The marshal read the charges: extortion, conspiracy, attempted murder, and the willful destruction of a public water source. "You'll never make it stick," Vane spat. The marshal looked at the crowd of faces, their expressions united in grim resolve. "I won't have to," he said. "They will." He and his deputy loaded Vane and Pike into a prison wagon for the long journey to the county seat. As the wagon rattled away, a collective sigh of relief seemed to rise from the town, as if a great weight had finally been lifted from their chests. In the weeks that followed, Dry Creek began to heal. The change was palpable. Eliza, with Pastor Crow's enthusiastic blessing, cleaned out an old storeroom in the church and started her evening school. Her first students were little Tom and the ranch hands, but soon the Miller children joined, and then a few of the adults who had spent their lives making an X's where their names should be. The soft glow of lamplight from the church windows at night became a new beacon for the town, a symbol of a future being written. Ruthie, a whirlwind of practical energy, established her women's fund, which she called the Root Cellar, a place to store up resources for the winter. It started with a handful of women putting a few pennies a week into a locked box in her shop. It was a small act of collective defiance, a declaration that they would look after their own, and never again be forced to beg for credit from a man like Vane. At Heart Mesa, Cole slowly began to walk again, first with crutches, then with a cane, a slight limp the only permanent reminder of the fight. The ranch was thriving in the wet spring, the horses growing sleek and the pastures turning a deep, rich green. He and Eliza had fallen into a new kind of partnership, a quiet rhythm of shared responsibilities and easy conversation. The wall of respect they had built was still there, but it now felt less like a boundary and more like the strong foundation of a house. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, painting the clouds in shades of orange and rose, Cole finally broke the comfortable silence. "The old arrangement is finished, Eliza," he said, not looking at her, but at the horizon. "When I hired you, I needed a housekeeper, someone to keep my books in order." He turned to face her, his gray eyes clear and serious. "That's not what I need anymore." Eliza's heart stilled. She waited. "This ranch, this house, it needs more than balanced books," he continued, his voice low and earnest. "It needs a conscience. It needs a heart. I'm asking you to stay, Eliza, not because I can offer you protection, but because I need a partner to help me build this place, to help me be the man this land deserves." He wasn't offering her a position. He was offering her a life, an equal share in the future they had both fought for. The proposal hung in the cooling air between them, a question of profound and lasting weight. She thought of the lonely girl with the basket of eggs, who walked with her head down to avoid the whispers. That girl was gone. In her place was a woman who had faced down her greatest fears and had found her own strength. This place, this man, this life, she had earned it. A few days later, they stood together by the banks of Juniper Spring. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the valley. A herd of Cole's horses, their coats gleaming, drank deeply from the clear, flowing water. A new season of planting had begun, and the air was filled with the smell of damp earth and the promise of new growth. Eliza knelt and dipped her hand into the cool stream. The water swirled around her fingers, clean and alive. It was the lifeblood of them all, the source of their conflict and their salvation. She looked from the water to Cole's face, and then out at the wide, peaceful valley. "It's not theirs or yours anymore," she said softly, a statement of fact that felt like a prayer. "It's ours." Part 7. Resolution, a choice, a vow, and the dawn. After the storm, the autumn that followed was a season of quiet mending. The land, saturated by the breaking of the drought, healed itself, the grasses growing thick and the cottonwoods along Juniper Spring turning a brilliant, defiant gold. The town of Dry Creek was mending, too, its new social fabric being stitched together day by day in the town meetings, in Ruthie's bustling tailor shop, and in the soft lamplight of Eliza's evening school. Word finally came from the county seat via the circuit judge, carried by a rider dusty from the long journey. The trial of Luther Vane and Asa Pike had been swift. The judge read from a letter, his voice clear in the still afternoon air as the town gathered once more by the spring. The physical evidence of the dam and the testimonies of Cole's ranch hands about the ambush were damning enough, but it was the other evidence, the things that couldn't be measured in logs and bullets, that had sealed Vane's fate. Pastor Crow, the letter recounted, had spoken for nearly an hour, his testimony a raw and public confession of his own moral cowardice, painting a vivid picture of the climate of fear Vane had so carefully cultivated. Ruthie Salgado, unflinching under the prosecutor's gaze, had presented copies of Eliza's ledgers and her own notes, her sharp mind recalling dates, names, and conversations with a precision that dismantled Vane's claims of legitimate business. But it was Eliza's original ledger, with its neat, steady handwriting, that had been the heart of the case. It was not just a book of numbers. It was the diary of a town's oppression. Vane was sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison for extortion, incitement to violence, and a dozen other charges. Asa Pike, for his part, received 5 years for corruption and abuse of office. The news was met not with cheers, but with a profound, collective sigh of relief. The shadow that had loomed over them for so long was finally, formally, gone. Life settled into a new, healthier rhythm. But for Eliza, one piece of her old life remained unsettled. The egg basket sat in the corner of her room at the mesa, a silent reminder of the girl who had walked in fear. The work at the ranch was fulfilling, her school a source of deep joy, and her partnership with Cole a quiet, steady warmth that was beginning to feel like home. But to truly be free, she knew she had to walk back through the ashes of her old humiliation and prove to herself that they could no longer burn her. The next Saturday, she filled the basket. Cole found her by the stables, ready to ride into town, the checkered cloth folded neatly on top of the eggs. His face was a mixture of concern and deep understanding. "You don't have to do this," he said softly. "You have nothing left to prove." "I have to prove it to myself." "Cole," she replied, her gaze meeting his, "I have to know that I can walk down that street and be Eliza Mayfield. Who sells eggs? Not Eliza Mayfield, the subject of a cruel joke." He nodded slowly, respecting her decision as he had promised he always would. He helped her onto her mare, his hand lingering for a moment on hers. "I'll be in town later," he said, "for the blacksmith." It was his way of saying, "I'll be close if you need me," without saying, "I'll be there to protect you." Walking into the market was like stepping into a memory. The sounds, the smells, the dust, it was all the same, but she was different. She laid out her cloth in the same spot, arranged her eggs, and waited. People greeted her with a new respect. Mrs. Miller stopped by to buy a dozen, pressing an extra nickel into her hand and saying, "For the school, dear." The blacksmith gave her a warm, gruff nod. Then, a voice from the past cut through the morning's peace. It was a freight driver passing through, a man who had been one of Vane's drinking companions, his face still holding the familiar stamp of casual cruelty. "Well, I'll be," he sneered, his eyes moving from Eliza to her basket, still playing the innocent little bird. "Are we? I heard Hart already found your—" He never finished the sentence before the vile old phrase could fully leave his lips. The blacksmith, who had been working at his forge nearby, was standing in front of him. The man was not large, but he was made of iron and leather, and his face was thunderous. "We don't talk that way in Dry Creek anymore," the blacksmith said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Not about her. Not about anyone. Now, you can buy something, or you can move your wagon on, but you will hold your tongue." The driver, stunned by the unexpected defense from a simple tradesman, blustered for a moment. But then he saw other faces turning toward him, Ruthie from her shop door, Hank the rancher, Mrs. Miller standing with her arms crossed. He was surrounded not by a mob, but by a quiet, unified wall of decency. He spat on the ground, muttered a curse, and shuffled away. Eliza watched it all, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. They hadn't just stared. They hadn't just looked away. They had spoken. They had stood for her. She had walked back through the fire and found that it had been extinguished. She sold the last of her eggs and rode back to the mesa, not with the weary relief of an ordeal survived, but with the light, soaring freedom of a battle truly won. That evening, she and Cole sat on the porch. The air was cool and smelled of pine and the coming winter. The awkwardness that had sometimes existed between them was gone, replaced by a deep, comfortable companionship. He had been limping less and less, and the hard lines of pain around his eyes had softened, replaced by a quiet contentment. He turned to her, his expression serious, his gray eyes searching her face in the twilight. "Eliza," he began, his voice steady. "When you first came here, you told me you paid your own way. And you've given this ranch more than I ever could have paid for. You've given it a future." He took a breath. "I don't want to be your employer anymore, and I don't want to just be your partner in business." He reached out and took her hand, his calloused thumb tracing a gentle circle on her skin. "I want to be your partner in life. I'm asking you to marry me, Eliza Mayfield." The question was simple, direct, and completely honest. It was everything he was. She looked at their joined hands, her small, ink-stained fingers resting in his large, weathered palm. She thought of his silent kindness in leaving the silver dollar, his fierce protection in the market, his raw vulnerability in confessing his past. She thought of the life they were already building, side by side. She lifted her eyes to his. "Yes," she whispered. Then she found her strength, her voice growing clearer. "Yes, but I want a promise first." He waited, his gaze unwavering. "Don't promise to protect me," she said, her voice filled with a quiet, earnest power. "You've done that, and I will always be grateful. But I can stand on my own now. Instead, promise to listen to me. Promise that my voice will always have a place in our home, in our life, that we will face things together, as equals." A slow smile spread across his face, a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed his rugged features. "Eliza Mayfield," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I promise to listen to you for the rest of my days." Their wedding was 2 weeks later, not in the church, but in a green meadow a short walk from Juniper Spring. There were no fancy clothes, no elaborate ceremony. Eliza wore a simple blue dress Ruthie had made, and Cole wore a clean shirt and his best trousers. Their guests were the family they had forged from the dust of Dry Creek Ruthie, her face shining with joy. Little Tom, standing straight and proud as Cole's witness. The ranch hands, scrubbed and awkward in their Sunday best. The blacksmith and his wife. The Miller family. Pastor Crow officiated, and he began the ceremony not with a prayer, but with an apology. "Before we join these two people," he said, his voice clear and strong, his eyes meeting those of his small congregation, "I must ask forgiveness from this community, and especially from Eliza. I was a shepherd who was silent when the wolves came. My fear allowed wickedness to grow in the shadows. I failed you. I can only promise to spend the rest of my days earning back the trust I broke." As Cole and Eliza exchanged their simple vows, a light, misty rain began to fall. It was not a storm, but a soft, gentle shower that seemed to bless the quiet ceremony, making the green grass greener and the air smell sweet and clean. It felt like a benediction. Later, as the small celebration wound down and the sun began to dip below the mesas, Eliza stood with Cole, looking out over the valley. The lights of Dry Creek were beginning to flicker on in the distance. The soft rain still fell, whispering on the leaves of the cottonwoods. She leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling a sense of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. She thought of Vane, a bitter man in a distant prison. She thought of the fear that had once been her constant companion, the whispers that had felt like chains. They had not defeated a man, they had done something much harder. "We didn't win against him, did we?" she said softly, more to herself than to him. "We won against the fear." Part 10. Epilogue, a season of full water and clean hands. 3 years passed. The seasons turned, each one leaving the land a little richer, the people a little surer, than the last. The scar on the earth where the brush fire had raged was now covered in a thick carpet of wildflowers, and the memories of Vane and Pike had faded from a raw wound to a faint, cautionary tale told to newcomers. Dry Creek was no longer a place defined by its thirst. At the entrance to town, where a trail of dust had once been the only welcome, a new sign stood, carved from a solid piece of cottonwood Dry Creek Cooperative. The name itself was a revolution. Vane's old saloon and mercantile had been bought by the community. Its ledgers of debt burned in a celebratory bonfire. Now, it was a store where families traded goods, where prices were fair, and where credit was a tool for mutual support, not a weapon of subjugation. The Water Committee, with Ruthie Salgado as its unshakable treasurer, managed the flow from Juniper Spring with a wisdom born of shared hardship, ensuring every farm and family had its share. The town well, dug deep and true in the center of the square, was a monument to their new reality. The loudest, happiest noise in town was the laughter of children. They played freely, their games no longer confined to the shadows. Among them, a young man of 15 stood taller than the rest, his shoulders broadening, his voice deepening. It was Thomas Little Tom Ortega. The terrified boy who had been snatched from the path of a runaway wagon was gone. In his place was a confident, skilled horseman, Cole Hart's right hand at the mesa and the star pupil of Eliza's school. He was the living embodiment of the town's promise, a future that had been rescued from the brink. The school itself, still housed in the church's old storeroom, was the town's beating heart. Its windows glowed with lamplight 4 nights a week, a beacon of literacy and hope that had drawn in not just children, but adults hungry for the power that came with a written word. On a warm spring afternoon, 2 riders followed the winding path of Juniper Spring, their horses moving at a gentle, unhurried pace. The creek was full and vibrant, its banks thick with willows and green reeds. Cole Hart sat tall in his saddle, the limp he'd acquired from his shattered leg now only a slight stiffness when he dismounted. The hard edges of his face had been softened by a constant, quiet happiness, though his gray eyes were as watchful and perceptive as ever. Beside him rode Eliza. Her hair was tied back simply, and her face held the calm, steady confidence of a woman who knew her own worth. She was several months pregnant, her condition a gentle, hopeful curve beneath her riding dress. Her hands, however, were still those of a woman who worked. She still kept the books for Hart Mesa, her clear, precise handwriting the final authority on every transaction, and she still taught her classes in the evenings, believing that literacy was as essential to a person's freedom as water was to their survival. Their conversation was the easy, meandering talk of a husband and wife who were also true partners. They spoke of the new foal in the north pasture, of the price of lumber for a new schoolhouse, of a letter from the county seat. "The marshal sent word," Cole said, guiding his horse around a patch of bright yellow poppies. "Pike's sentence was extended. Seems he knew more about Vane's other business dealings than he first let on." Eliza nodded. "And Vane? He's not getting out, ever." Cole's voice was flat, without triumph. It was simply a fact, a closing of a dark chapter. They rode in comfortable silence for a while. The only sounds, the creak of leather, the gentle splash of hooves, and the song of the creek. They stopped at a particular bend, where a large, flat rock offered a place to rest. Here, another, smaller change was visible. Someone had carved a small, simple totem and placed it at the base of a cottonwood tree. It was a piece of smoothed wood, into which little Tom had painstakingly carved a sentence with the knife Eliza had given him on his last birthday. The letters were not perfect, but they were clear and deep. "Water is life, honor is the well." Eliza ran her fingers over the carved words. It was their town's new scripture, a creed born not from a distant holy book, but from their own shared struggle and salvation. It was the truth they had paid for in fear and courage. Cole watched her, his love for her a tangible presence in the quiet air. He had promised to listen, and in the years since their wedding, he had learned that her voice was the truest compass he had. She had brought not just order and love to his house, but a wisdom that had helped guide the entire community. "Are you sure about tomorrow?" he asked softly, his gaze dropping to her rounded belly. She smiled, a serene, knowing smile. "I'm sure." The next morning was a Saturday. The sun rose on a world washed clean by an overnight shower, and the air smelled of damp earth and new beginnings. Eliza came down to the kitchen to find a familiar basket sitting on the table, filled with fresh, perfect eggs she had gathered herself. She rode into Dry Creek, not on her old, slow mare, but on a gentle, steady-gaited horse Cole had trained for her. She was no longer a girl walking a long, dusty road, but a woman riding into the center of her own life. The market was alive with the vibrant, cheerful chaos of a prosperous community. The blacksmith's hammer rang a steady rhythm, the scent of misses. Miller's baking mingled with the smell of fresh-cut lumber. Eliza was greeted with smiles and friendly calls. "Morning. Eliza, those eggs for the school bake sale." "How are you feeling? Ma'am, that little one giving you any trouble?" She found an open space on a trestle table, not in the dirt, but on a clean wooden surface, and took out her checkered cloth from long habit. She began to arrange the eggs, her movements unhurried and peaceful. She was not the same girl who had once built these small pyramids as a shield against the world. Now, it was just a simple, satisfying task, an echo of a past she no longer fled. Across the square, Cole stood talking with the blacksmith, their conversation easy and familiar. He was not watching her, not standing guard. He was simply there, a part of the same thriving world she was. He caught her eye, and his face broke into that slow, unguarded smile that was still reserved mostly for her. It was a smile of pure love, of a man looking at his wife, his partner, his whole world. Eliza smiled back. A soft breeze stirred, carrying the scent of wet grass and the promise of a fine day. She placed the last egg in its place, her hands steady, her head high, her heart completely and utterly at peace. Thank you for listening to this story. Please let me know where you're tuning in from in the comments below, so we can all connect and share our thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to my channel, Wild West Night, like this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.